All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Northeastern University School of Law. We are so happy to have you here with us this evening. For those of you who have traveled from across the country, we hope that your trip was fine without too many problems. We know how traveling can be these days. The, I'd like to take just a minute to introduce our dean. Is he still here? He had to leave. Okay. Yes, well, we'll be able to hear from him tomorrow, but I just want to acknowledge his presence for coming by. The Center for Law, Equity, and Race is pleased to serve as the host as we gather to continue some of the discussions that started at the Race Center convening in February that was hosted by the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU School of Law. A new center has been established since we met back in February, the Center for Civil Rights and Social Justice at Emory University, and we're so glad to have them here with us today. Yeah, unfortunately, since we met, we have witnessed the expulsion or silencing of duly elected state representatives in Tennessee and Montana, an accelerated attack on women's reproductive freedom way beyond what was anticipated by the Dobbs decision, the proliferation of shootings of unarmed black and brown children for either ringing the wrong doorbell, answering the door, or accused of stealing a bottle of water. I could go on and on with other examples of the assault, basic freedoms, and fundamental rights. As one of our creative geniuses once said, sometimes it makes me want to holler and throw up both my hands. But instead of doing that, we are going to engage with two of our thought leaders to help frame some of the issues for our discussions and deliberations tomorrow and develop strategies to move forward. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce Rahsaan Rahsaan, Rash, Rahsaan. I always put the H, no H. Hall, who is the who is the newly appointed president and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. So let's congratulate him on that new position. But he is also the founder and principal of Rahsaan Hall Consulting, where he has provided experienced racial justice and criminal law reform advocacy. In 2022, he ran for Plymouth County District Attorney on a platform of progressive reform, which garnered support and endorsements from around the country. Previously, he served as the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, where he helped to develop their integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. He managed their What Difference a DA Makes campaign to educate state residents about the power and influence of district attorneys. Prior to joining ACLU of Massachusetts, he was the deputy director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice and also served as assistant district attorney in Suffolk County, which includes the city of Boston. He serves on several community boards and is an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Let's welcome Rahsaan Hall. Margaret Burnham, who is an internationally recognized expert on, on civil and human rights, comparative constitutional rights, and international criminal law. She's the faculty co-director of the Center for Law, Equity, and Race, and founded and directs the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, which investigates racial justice violence in the Jim Crow era and other historical failures of the criminal justice system. Last year in September, the Burnham Nobles Archive was launched with over 1,000 cases based on research of Northeastern University and other law students. It is a publicly available digital archive that continues to grow. her book, by hands now known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, which is based on cases in the archive, recently won the 2023 Hillman Prize for Book Journalism, which recognizes achievement in investigative journalism that serves the public interest. Please welcome Margaret Burnham. And now we turn over to them. As a disclaimer, we were attempting to figure out how can we get a fire for the fireside chat.
It's going to be a hot conversation, whether there's a fireside or not. Thank you so much, Deborah Jackson, and just so pleased to welcome all of you from outside of Boston to our humble law school, a humble and wonderful law school, and so happy to be in conversation with my dear brother Rahsaan, who is, Deborah, I don't think Deborah mentioned this, an alum of Northeastern University School of Law, in addition to his many other achievements. Rahsaan and I are in conversation, seeking to clarify our own thinking and helping to set, perhaps to generate some thoughts that might carry us through the next day as we consider what our centers might be doing collectively or individually to confront the current political moment. So folks, you know, if at the beginning of the 20th century, the 21st century, this century, you know, someone mentioned in serious political conversation the words fascism or civil war or disunion or secession in the context of the US political reality, they would basically be laughed out of the room. They would be told, oh, you know, this is extremism, this is not the US, this will never happen in the US, and they would be deemed to be on the far end of some political spectrum. And so here we are today. You know, in the post-Obama era, we had 2016 and the incipient fascism that period introduced. And we thought we beat it back in 2020, only to find out in 2020, in January of 2021, that it was still very much alive and well. And so it's that threat that brings us into conversation over the next day or so. And it's a threat that, you know, that is seeped into sort of every corner of our political space, our town halls, our school board meetings, our state legislatures, and of course, our own Supreme Court. And it's a threat that brings with it not just a changed political landscape and political discourse where ideas and the potential for fascism looms large, but it's also a threat that has brought with it enormous violence generated by obviously anti-racism, anti-Semitism, you know, the deep deep hatred for people who are poor and living on the margins, and threats, of course, against people who represent gender minorities. So all of that is on the table. But what is also true of this moment is that but for the marching and the movements led by mostly people of color in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, of Mike Brown and the uprising in Ferguson in 2014, followed by Breonna Taylor and, of course, George Floyd, and the so-called reckoning that reached every corner of the American economic and social and educational world in 2020. That but for those events and the activities and protests that they spawned, led mostly by people of color, our centers would not exist. And so it is a moment of deep threat, but also a moment of enormous possibility. And I say all that to put to us the question what that means for us as legal educators and as the directors of these centers. What does it mean for our internal agendas, for what we should be leading and directing and imagining for our own schools, and also what does it mean for our external partners, with the folks on the outside, on the ground, with whom we eventually will be partnering. And so, you know, I want to speak to both of those issues. On the internal agenda, first of all, let me just say that I don't think this is a moment. I think this is our future, that our future will be defined by contestation, deep and lasting contestation over racism, over gender discrimination, over attacks on women, and over climate justice. That those issues that are defining the political arena today, those issues that have given rise to new progressive leadership in Congress and elsewhere, that have also introduced to the American public and to the American discourse through candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, progressive ideas, dare I say left ideas, the word capitalism, now a common topic for discussion across the political arena. So that's the environment in which we are swimming. And so for us on the internal side, I would simply say we need to be mindful of the development in universities of initiatives around diversity, inclusion, and equity, and their relationship with our centers. And, you know, these are all wonderful developments. They're about, you know, the full and meaningful integration of our student populations and of our faculty and teachers and of our staff. And we need to be completely supportive of that. But those structural changes, if they are structural changes, are not going to take us as far as we need to go to confront the moment that we face today. And so we also need to think about how we can lead the fundamental cultural changes that have to take place at our institutions if we are to be ready for the next, say, 10 years, right? And those changes have to be curricula-based, but they have to be beyond that. I mean, we have to really begin to think about how we can challenge and transform the very the fundamental principles of legal education, which in many respects have led our students to feel a kind of, and that's all our students of color as well as white students, to feel a kind of cognitive dissonance. They come into these law schools and they've read about George Floyd, and they've read about climate justice, and they've read about struggles around immigration, and those are the issues that they want to grapple with and deal with. And yet they're forced to read, they're required to read cases from the 1950s and the 1960s that camouflage these issues and leave them in a state of, at best, intellectual confusion, but more likely kind of intellectual violence, where their own sort of community and cultural identities become threatened and questioned every day as I sit in law school classrooms. All of us went to law school. We all endured that. But we have to challenge the notion that it's endemic to and deeply embedded in law school education, and there's no way to undo it for our own students and for the future of legal education. That's on the internal front. On the external side, we have to figure out what our relationship is going to be to the progressive movements and the movements, anti-racist movements that are out there today. There's many of you represent and are in conversation with, and Rahsaan certainly, with a broad and deep and young and hungry leadership out there that are using, all kinds of new ways of communicating, building movements, figuring out how to engage with direct action in new and really exciting ways. And yeah, 1,000 flowers may very well bloom, but at some point for us as centers, our resources are limited, and we have to figure out where we can make the most impact in a field of activism that can be exciting, but also can be in some ways quite confusing because of the number of initiatives and the different perspectives that are out there. This has to, I think we need to do this both on an individual, center by center basis, figure out the communities in which we're based, but also there may be some collective thinking that we can do around these issues. So this is a conversation. My boss, Deborah Jackson, told me earlier today, she said, you're in conversation, don't forget it, right? And Rahsaan has a lot to say about this too, so,
Yes.
Rahsaan.
Well, thank you, Margaret. And thank you all for coming from near and far to be here. This is such important work and such important conversations that are happening right now, and the impact that they'll have on the nation is so important. Also, happy Pride as we kick off Pride Month. And let's go Nuggets for all of the basketball fans, because I'm born and raised in Denver, Colorado. So,
We should be there. You agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. The
Okay.
Celtics should have definitely been there.
Okay.
Yeah, no diss to the Miami fans. When we think about this conversation around kind of the threats to our democracy and the role of these justice centers that you all are a part of, one of the things that has captured my imagination over the last several years is this idea of the death throes of white supremacy. What we've been seeing over the last several years are the last-ditch efforts of this ideology that has been at the foundation of this nation's inception. It's the threads that run through our identity and the fabric of this country that people are struggling to hang on to. And so throughout the history of this country, you can always see this pendulum swing back and forth. You look at the end of slavery and Reconstruction, you see the post-Reconstruction era, you see the civil rights movement of the 40s through the 60s, and you see the Nixon administration and the war on drugs. You see Obama, and then we get Trump. And so there is a significant amount of backlash that we're experiencing, but it coincides with the browning of our nation. It coincides with the queering of our nation. It coincides with a post-Christendom era that we are living in, and this ideology that centers the notion of heteropatriarchy, white male heteropatriarchy, as the identity of America and what America is coming under attack from some people's perspective. And so the initiatives that we see politically I think are an attempt to hold on to that identity and hold on to those threads. Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, really talks about it when we think particularly about the criminal legal system and the way that caricatures and stereotypes and narratives have been perpetuated and then politicized by turning policy decisions against communities of color. And it's based off of themes about people's reluctance to work or just being lazy, or people's criminalistic characteristic, and that gets baked into the policy decisions that were being made, that have been made throughout history. And so it's important, and we've seen it before, that academic institutions are a part of the vanguard to push back against this retrenchment of rights and progress that have been made. You look at the 60s and the Black Studies movement that emerged, and subsequently kind of critical race theory that emerged out of that. It's people in academia who have been challenging some of the theories and the ideas that have been the basis of the condemnation of Black people and our personhood and people of color and the other, whoever that may be. And so when we think about the racial justice centers, that is again the call for such a time as this, to be the vanguard of taking the information, taking the theory, challenging the ideologies, and distilling it in a way that is accessible to the public. You all are responsible for training the next generation of leaders and advocates and foot soldiers who are going to be out there, that are going to push back against the narratives, that are going to push back against the legislation that's going to be proposed, that are going to be the candidates that run, that are going to lead the organizations that are doing the social engineering work that really help us maintain our foothold in society and stop this retrenchment of rights and progress that was made. One of the things that I think about, particularly as it relates to the role of academia, it comes from when I was in seminary. And one of my Old Testament professors used to say, when we take a critical literary analysis of scripture, it raises all kinds of questions for people. Like, wait, who wrote this? When did they write this? And what did they leave out? And what other parts aren't we talking about? And how is it inconsistent with these other parts? And that's what happens in seminary. But my seminary professor said, that's the inner workings of the watch. As a reverend, your job isn't to preach the inner workings of the watch. You're just supposed to tell the people what time it is. Understanding the inner workings of the watch helps you preach what time it is. And so what people in academia should be doing is deconstructing and making plain to the generations of evangelists and preachers in this battle for racial justice how the watch works, but then help them cultivate the narrative of what time it is. And I think that's particularly important in this era when there is a significant dumbing down of America. The threats to academic institution, to curriculum that are educating people on the reality of who this country is, the real history of what has happened in this country, so that we are not doomed to repeat it. And it's also particularly important as we are on the verge of machine learning and artificial intelligence, that even people in the industry, Gavin, have come forward and said, this thing is a problem, and we need to put some guardrails in place now. And so you take the kind of the culmination of these, last-ditch efforts to maintain this white supremacist ideology that's rooted in this, that this nation is rooted in, the dumbing down of America, and then you throw on top of this machine learning that has little to no ethics or moral guidelines. It's all the more important that you all are using data and academic research and challenging the theories and precepts that exist to make sure that the foot soldiers, the evangelists, the preachers, however we want to define the people that you are educated, are going out there in the world prepared to do the work that's going to shift what's happening in our country.
So, Rahsaan, let me ask you this. So you have worked for the Lawyers Committee, the Civil Liberties Union. You've been a U.S. Assistant District Attorney in Suffolk County, and you've run for as a progressive prosecutor in a county where the chances of electoral victory were there, but they were not overwhelming. So, how do you think, in any one of those, wearing any one of those hats, what do you see the role of a center based in a law school, dedicated to the training of law students? What kind of partnership, relationship would such a center beneficially have for you in any one of those positions? And I should also add, now you're Urban League. You've moved around a little bit, my man.
It's funny because when I was next door in class and they would invite people in to come and talk, and they were like, you know, the president of some corporation or a partner at a firm, and I was just like, wow, how did they get there? And, you know, here I am. It's been an amazing journey. But to that end, I think one of the things that I've realized along that journey is that I want to use the word partnership very carefully because academic institutions have a different role in society and have different standards and requirements about the content that is produced. And advocacy organizations have a different role. Sometimes those overlap, but I think you know, partnering on some things can happen, but when we get into the advocacy space, which for me is the priority, my role at the Lawyers Committee or the ACLU or now at the Urban League, I need to be on the cutting edge. I need to be a little more strident in the things that I say, and sometimes what a professor is going to say in academic research is going to, you know, kind of split it down the middle to say, well, we can't say one way or the other that this is definitely because of racism. As an advocate, I'm saying it's racist, and so those partnerships or the potential for partnerships becomes very tenuous. That said, I think the content that gets produced and the human capital that exists in these institutions are so important because it's the fodder or the ammunition for, maybe I should use a better analogy, but it's what fuels some of the work that we do. You know, the study that Debbie's husband commissioned through Harvard, looking at racial disparities in the criminal legal system, was something that we as advocates at the ACLU and other progressive advocacy organizations were waving, saying this data is here to show that there are significant racial disparities in the criminal legal system, and it is because of the decision, in part because of police, but also because of prosecutors, the charging decisions that they make, the discretion that they have in breaking down or whether or not they break down a particular case. And that was so valuable to have that. Similarly, it was because of interns that we had. Again, Gavin, when I was at the Lawyers Committee, who came in and did the research and work on the litigation matters that we were handling. So it's ultimately the responsibility of academic institutions, I feel, is to make sure that everything that is, not everything, but a lot of the things that are produced are accessible to community. The other challenge, one with the tension around partnerships, is that people in community are the experts of their own situation. And sometimes I think there is a significant blind spot when people in academia say, well, here's the legal theory, or here's how we can win this case, or here's what the data shows, but the people with the lived experience in the community are saying, yeah, but that's not going to work in my life, or in our community, or from the experience that I've had and have had to navigate over the years, this is what I know is going to work, or this is what I know is going to motivate our people. And so how do we reconcile that tension that exists? And so absent meaningful relationships, and not just we have a partnership or a memorandum of understanding, but folks from academia are actually showing up in the community, not in an extractive way, but in a way that is supporting the community. Sometimes it's just, you're having a community event, or you're having a cookout, I'm gonna be there, just to show you that I'm caring and I wanna know more about you and I wanna learn and grow. I think lastly, in the role of a candidate, it was the research and the reports, the study that came out, I think NYU, that looked at what happened here in Suffolk County, where former District Attorney Rachel Rollins had a policy to dismiss certain cases, and to look at the fact that people who were not prosecuted for certain low-level offenses were less likely to come back into court. The recidivism rate was much lower. I ran on that, right? Because everybody was saying, oh, he's, soft on crime and he cares more about criminals than victims. And I'm like, I care about data and research and what the facts say. And let's take a harm reduction approach to this situation when we know that if we put people in the system, the likelihood that they're going to continue to recidivate and cycle through this system is increased. So let's find alternatives to that. And it was because of some academic research that I was able to make that argument. It didn't work, but I think, it's not the researcher's fault, and it ain't my fault.
Well, it did work in a way, because you ran a fabulous campaign and you
Thank
got
you.
your message out there, and you broke new ground. I want to push back a little bit on your point about the relationship of academics to community organizations. So I certainly agree that at the end of the day, community knowledge, lived community experience is critical in formulating policy, in making decisions about which course to follow, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But that's something that our law students need to learn.
Yes.
What they're learning in law school essentially is that the world is, a hierarchical structure, that the law is hierarchical, that, wisdom comes from their professor and not from any other places. Mm-hmm. And so it's critically important that students understand that working with communities is going to take longer. It's going to be harder work. It's going to require a certain level of patience. Right. But that the knowledge that can be derived in that process mm-hmm. Is going to make them a stronger professional lawyer. Yes. That it's going to make them a better communicator, and it's going to put them in a position where they understand that their knowledge, all of it, is limited, mm-hmm. And that without a fully informed sense of a particular problem, which can only come from deep engagement with communities, they can't do their job. Right. They can't properly do their job. So that, I think, is also part of what we as centers have to begin to prioritize, that in all of our projects, the community, not input is the wrong word, and partnership is the right word, that engagement between the students and communities, a back and forth across the table where each brings a certain different a different kind of input is critically important.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. And so, kind of coming back to this idea about the threats to our democracy that we are facing, when we look at, I think it can be said by some that the civil rights movements of the 40s through the 60s really tested the mettle of American democracy, and some may even argue that it wasn't fully a democracy until the fruits of that civil rights movement. When we look at the advocacy, the resistance, the leadership of people in the movement at that time, they were fighting against what I was talking about earlier, are these notions of who this country is and the policies that grow out of it. Fast forward to the time frame that we're sitting in now. Are those threads of white supremacy or nativism, or however we want to define what it is that is driving some of the more regressive policies and attacks on marginalized people, do those threads still exist in the same way? And to the extent that these centers are engaged in combating it, what is the particular role that they need to have or work that they need to do?
So I focus with my students on the as you know, the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s for a particular reason. These are folks who are getting a sort of a liberal view of the law from everything that they face in law school. And so that gets reinforced every day that they're in school. If you look at the American experience, and particularly if you look at the American experience in the South in the 1930s and 1940s, you cannot but come away with the conclusion that authoritarian reality was what defined the state at that time. And by state, I mean the state of Alabama, the state of Louisiana, but I also mean the state, small s state. Right. That these were, in every sense of the word, authoritarian states. That's not to say that they weren't functioning states. And there's a difference between an illegitimate state and a non-functioning state. These were illegitimate states that were still functioning. And the students need to get that point. They need to understand that you can have a state, I mean, what defines a legitimate state is one where everyone has an equal opportunity to reach the powers that be, to address the powers that be, to petition, to dare I say, to vote, that everyone has the ear, can reach the ear with whatever issue it is they have. That's a legitimate state. States in the South were, by that definition, completely illegitimate. Political scientists would say that they were authoritarian states. So my students don't have to go to an international human rights course in order to appreciate what an illegitimate state looks like and how law functions within that state. And so in looking at the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, they're grasping exactly what all that meant on the ground. That's the first purpose of the work. The second purpose is their client is the community. Their client are the individuals and the families who were affected by these events. And that goes to your earlier point that the only way to learn how to be an effective practitioner is to learn how to listen to others who bring a different sense of knowledge and a different experience. And there's no intervention with that relationship between the student and the families that they work with. So both of those purposes, both of those ends, which in my view should run across the law school curriculum, I try to realize in this program that brings to life the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Now, to your point, what if any, the resemblance is between that era. No one at that point thought they were living in an undemocratic, except black folk, except the folks whose whose neck was being cut. No one else thought that they thought this was, this is the era of the four freedoms. This is the era of World War II. This is the era of the fight for democracy, for global democracy. That's the era we're talking about. So, rendering visible that reality in that period is very much the work that we have got to do today. And it's ongoing work. And, you say, okay, well, at at some point it was all over and we had a full-blown, expressive, and real democracy. Not really. This is, as I said at the very inception, this is going to be with us for a while. As you say, it's in the DNA. It's part of what we and our children are going to face. And the point for us to figure out is, how do we sharpen our weapons? That is not to say that battles can't be won. If you had, if 20 years ago again, if you'd said, let's legalize marijuana. What? Legalize weed? Let's get rid of student debt. What? Get rid of student debt? Really? So, these things will come to pass. Right? They can come to pass. And when they do, obviously, we need to celebrate. But it's going to be a struggle all the way. And the question for us is, at what point are we entering that battle, and how far up the hill can we push the rock? We're the only thing standing between these good people and their dinner. And
we don't want to take it too much longer, do we? How much time do we have? Wrapping up, okay. So off of that, I think one of the more profound things, well, not more profound, but one of the things that I found very profound that the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Center did was the creation of a film that told the story of a particular investigation and the work that the students did on that. And I think it was so impactful because it was flesh on the bones. And it's a powerful storytelling has always been a powerful tool. It's what helps organizers do their works. It's what changes political narratives. Can you talk a little bit about how these centers can use different assets like film or social media or podcasts or the press to do this narrative shifting, to preach what time it is?
Yeah, no, so I think for every center, this is all student-led work. The podcast, the videos that we've done is all student-led. This requires that centers partner not across the university, that they partner with other departments in the university, journalism programs, media programs, archivists, and others. And we certainly have done that here. And those valuable partnerships for us as well as for our partners. I will say that the other, you mentioned the earlier movements of the 20th century, and I will say that the other, in addition to the use of these new and exciting and also threatening, Gavin, tools, I would say that the other thing that's different, important difference here, is that the organizers of today take as their floor intersectionality. The sense that our fates are intertwined, that the fate of all people of color and those who are gender oppressed people, trans people, that these are all intertwined struggles that will rise together or fall together. And that's new. That's really a completely 21st century development. It's a development that's come out of these Black-led movements around, as I said, George Floyd, et cetera. But that's new. It's here to stay. And it certainly has to define, although our centers are about race, it certainly has to define, help our centers define their own agendas. So that climate change has to be on our agenda, even if it's on the agenda of some other center. As you said, the patriarchy and the efforts to push women back to the way back. That has to be on our agenda, even if it's on the agenda of some other center. So, yeah,
Right.
that will be my wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah, we thank them for a very powerful conversation in terms of beginning to identify some of the issues. And this is just laying the groundwork for tomorrow's session that we will continue with that. So let's thank them again for their presentation. So now that we've had food for thought, we are going to serve some food for nourishment and continue the conversations. We will be starting tomorrow morning with registration at 8 o'clock. We'll be back in this building on the second floor, and we'll have people to help guide you. So thank you so much for coming out. We hope that you will stay, partake with dinner, and continue to have some conversations as we figure out ways to tell people what time it is. I like that metaphor. So thank you so much, and enjoy the evening.